May 1845. The Thames. Two ships are moored at Greenhithe, the Erebus and the Terror. Both are reinforced with oak slabs and wrought iron against Arctic ice. Both are powered by steam engines taken from railway locomotives. Both are loaded with provisions for 3 years in advance. Canned goods, flour, salinina, chocolate, and lemon juice to combat scurvy. There are 134 people on board. The expedition is commanded by Sir John Franklin, an experienced polar explorer, participant in 3 Arctic expeditions, a Knight of the Orders, a man of repute. He is 59 years old. He has never lost a ship. The goal, the Northwest Passage, a sea route through Arctic waters north of Canada that would connect the Atlantic with the Pacific Ocean and shorten the trade route to Asia by thousands of miles. Britain has been searching for this passage for over 300 years. Several expeditions perished, and several returned empty-handed. By 1845, one uncharted stretch remained several hundred miles between already charted coastlines. The Admiralty believed Franklin would resolve this issue in 1 winter, perhaps 2. The ships departed Greenhithe in May. After a stop near Greenland, 5 men were sent home due to illness, and 129 sailed for the Arctic. They were last seen in July. 2 whaling ships encountered the Erebus and the Terror at the entrance to Bafino Bay. The whalers' captains recorded in their logs that the crew appeared healthy and the mood on board was cheerful. Franklin claimed to have provisions for 5 years, although the documents indicated only 3. Then the ships encountered ice and disappeared. The search only began in 1848. 3 years of silence is no reason to panic. The Arctic requires patience. But when the first search expeditions reached the supposed route, they found nothing. No ships, no camps, no people. For the next 10 years, the British Navy and private expeditions systematically combed the Canadian Arctic in search of the 129 men, finding only fragments, tin cans, scraps of clothing, skeletons, and the famous note written on 2 layers, which explained everything and nothing. A new piece of the answer only emerged in 2014, and what they discovered on the Arctic floor turned out to be more terrifying than anything previously imagined. To understand why Franklin's expedition became a disaster, one must understand the place it entered. The Canadian Arctic archipelago is thousands of islands, straits, and bays, locked in perennial ice for most of the year. This ice doesn't just impede movement, it compresses the hull, and rises into building high ice packs. A ship that finds itself there can no longer choose its route. Who waits for the ice to either read Summer here lasts a few weeks, then comes darkness, frost, wind, and complete silence. No communication, no help, London, the Admiralty, families in England. All this remains behind thousands of miles of ice water and tundra. By 1845, British polar expeditions had accumulated enough experience to know that Arctic wintering kills. Franklin's previous expedition from 1819 to 1822 overland along the coast of Canada ended with 11 of the 20 men dying from hunger, cold, and, according to some sources, cannibalism among the survivors. Franklin himself nearly died. This episode made him famous in Britain, the man who ate his boots and simultaneously raised the first doubts about his suitability for Arctic command. But the Admiralty ignored these doubts. The Erebus and Terror were considered Britain's finest polar vessels. They had already wintered in Antarctica and returned intact. Their hulls were reinforced with oak and iron, steam engines were installed, and their propellers were ice-protected. According to the Admiralty's logic, if any ship could navigate the Northwest Passage, it was these. Officially, they carried provisions for 3 years. 8,000 cans of meat, vegetables, and soups. The technology was already known, but still risky given the volumes and time frame involved. a library of 1,200 volumes, musical instruments, and engraved. Silver cutlery were also present. The commander's table was set according to all the rules of British naval etiquette, even in Arctic waters. This was an expedition that intended not just to survive, but to achieve its goal with dignity. Franklin led the ships northwest. The first summer was a success. They passed through Lancaster Sound, checked north through Wellington Channel, found no passage there, and turned south. By the autumn of 1845, Erebus and Terror reached Beechey Island. Here, the expedition spent its first winter. The island provided at least some protection from the ice pressure, and the ships were frozen off the coast. The winter of 1845 passed here. 3 graves were found on Beechey Island. This was the first discovery of the search expeditions that reached this place in 1850. 1851. 3 gravestones with names. John Thorington, a fireman on there, died on January 1st, 1846, aged 20. John Hartnell, a sailor on Erebus, died on January 4th, 1846, aged 25. William Brain, a Terror Marine, died on April 3rd, 1846. At age 32, 3 times during his first winter. It wasn't a disaster. Casualties were common on Arctic expeditions, but this was a signal no one could read in 1845 between 1984 and 1986. It's all people. In Gulf Macedonia, anthropologist Owen Peaty and colleagues exhumed all 3 bodies. The Arctic cold preserved them almost intact, soft tissue, skin, clothing. It was a rare opportunity to understand what was killing Franklin's men from the very beginning. The test results were unexpected. The tissues of all 3 were found to contain abnormally high levels of lead, dozens of times higher than normal. Thorington, the youngest, had particularly high levels. He also showed signs of tuberculosis and was clearly emaciated. Where did all that lead come from? The most common theory is tin cans. Spire Stephen Goldner prepared those same 8,000 cans of provisions for the expedition. The contract was canceled at the last minute. The deadline was tight, and Goldner was apparently in a hurry. The seams of the cans were sealed with lead solder, a common practice at the time. But if the soldering was done carelessly, the solder could have leached into the contents. This theory would later be disputed. The lead could have come from other sources, and the level of poisoning itself might not have been as critical as initially thought. But one thing is clear. Franklin's men were entering the most dangerous part of the journey, no longer in perfect condition. This is important. This is crucial for what would happen next. The ice was beginning to break up. The expedition moved south. The route Franklin chose lay through Peel Sound and then between Prince of Wales Island in the west and the Boothia Peninsula in the east. That season, the ice opened enough for the ships to proceed further. But to the south, a zone of heavy drift ice awaited them. A more easterly route through James Ross Strait might have been freer, but Franklin didn't know that. The maps were incomplete. Aerial reconnaissance was impossible. Decisions were made almost blind. By September 1846, the ships reached a point northwest of King William Island, approximately 70 north latitude, 98 degrees west longitude, 98 degrees west longitude. And here, the ice closed around them again. Erebus and Terror settled in for their second winter. It was September. The navigation season was over. Open water to the west was less than 100 miles away. 100 miles they never traveled. The winter of 1847 was spent in ice near King William Island. In the spring, officers continued sledging expeditions to the island shore, exploring the area and taking samples. Everything looks like a routine wintering. On May 24th, 1847, Lieutenant Gore's party left the ships, and on May, they left a standard navigation document on the shore. a tin cylinder with a note inside. This was standard procedure. Such notes were left on the shores as signal beacons for search expeditions. The note stated, "All is well. The ships are in ice. The crew is healthy." So John Franklin is commanding the expedition. Everything is going according to plan. 3 weeks later, John Franklin died. The exact date of his death is June 11, 1847. The cause is unknown. No medical records survive. He was 61 years old. He spent almost 2 years in the Arctic ice. Perhaps illness, perhaps heart problems, perhaps accumulated poisoning. Crown did the trick. We don't know. Command passed to Captain Francis Crozier, the commander of the Terror, an experienced polar officer and participant in several Arctic and Arctic expeditions in business. His deputy was Captain James Fahmes of the Erebus. By the time Franklin died, the expedition's situation was already dire. Several more people died during the winter of 1846 to 1847. The exact number is unknown. There were fewer provisions than planned. The ice did not let up. The summer of 1847 passed and again brought no relief. The ships remained where they were. A third winter in the ice. Spring 1848, April 25. Crozier and Fahmes left the main written trace of the expedition's fate. They found the very same tin cylinder with the note "Mountain" and wrote over it. In the margins of the existing document, around it upside down, wherever there was room, the note read, "By this time, 24 of the crew, including Sir John Franklin, had died." The ships had been locked in ice for 19 months. On April 22, 1848, the remaining 105 people abandoned the ships. On April 26, they were supposed to go south to the Buck River. They were going to the Buck River, the only known route that led from the Arctic coast to populated areas. To the mouth of the river was about 250 miles of travel through tundra, ice, and taros, with heavy boats, provisions, and equipment. For 105 weak, sick, and hungry people, it was a death march. Why were they dragging boats? This is a question that many researchers have asked. Inuit who met groups of Crucia people on the coast of King William Island later reported seeing white men pulling huge heavy sleds with boats that they could hardly move. Move. Boats were needed to cross the water, but they also killed people with their weight. Each of these boats weighed hundreds of kilograms. Dragging it across the rope-filled ice when you were sick and hungry was murder. The Inuit, the indigenous people of these areas, later played a key role in what became known about the last weeks of the expedition. Several groups of Inuit saw the Crozier's men in the spring and summer of 1848. They tried to trade with them, exchanging scraps of meat for metal objects. Some of these conversations were recorded by explorer Charles Francis Hall in the 1860s when he specifically went to the Arctic to collect Inuit testimony. What the Inuit reported was terrifying and consistent. They saw a group of people who could barely move. People fell and couldn't get up. Some died right there on the ice. Some were in uniform, others in rags. They asked for food with gestures. They looked as if they hadn't slept for many days. An Inuit witness, whose words Hall recorded nearly 20 years later, spoke of a large group of men pulling sleds across the ice south of King William Island. Among them was a tall man, carried on the sled. He was ill. He died shortly after the group stopped for the night. Inuit accounts are not documents. They were passed down orally, often through translators, and written down years after the events. The accuracy of individual details cannot be verified, but the overall picture they paint matches what was later confirmed by physical finds Human bones were found on the shores of King William Island and on the mainland opposite at a place the Inuit called Kiyuna and Europeans mapped as Cape Starvation. They were first discovered in 1859 by Irish captain Francis Leopold Magatixi, who specially equipped a search expedition on the steam yacht Fox. It was his men who found the tin cylinder with a double note, Gore's note from 1847. King and Crozier and Fitzjames's notes from April 1848. This was the main written document that directly reported the expedition's fate. In addition to the note, William McClintock and his officer, William Hobson, found an abandoned sled on King Island. A boat lay on the sled. In the boat were 2 human skeletons. Next to the bones were silver cutlery with officers' monograms, books, silk, handkerchiefs, combs, and soap. Expensive and completely useless things. Expatriates. They were carried across the Arctic by dying people who couldn't afford to abandon what they had brought from home. This is one of the most terrifying details of the entire story. No weapons, no tools, no medicine, no silver spoons or books. Either this is evidence that people clung to a sense of normal life to the last, or, and this is quite possible, that their lead-poisoned brains were no longer capable of correctly assessing priorities. Later, studies of the bones from King William Island showed lead was indeed present in the remains of those who died on the march. But the further science progressed, the more cautious the conclusions became. Today, lead poisoning no longer seems the only explanation for the disaster. Rather, it was one of several factors, along with cold, hunger, scurvy, exhaustion, and decisions that became increasingly worse as people's strength ran out. And then came the most serious discovery. Analysis of the bones from King William Island revealed another. Some bones. Border cut marks. Not random, but precise. Characteristic of butchering on the long bones of the legs and arms. On the ribs. Erebus. Marks that in forensic practice are unambiguously interpreted as signs of cannibalism. This was not a sensation for those who studied the Inuit evidence. Inuit had been reporting this as early as the 1850s. And then they were not believed. The British Admiralty and Franklin's widow, Lady Jane Franklin, categorically rejected the very possibility that British naval officers could have gone to such lengths. Explorer John Ray, who in 1854 was the first to bring back Inuit evidence and several items belonging to expedition members from the Arctic, was met with distrust and even hostility in London. Charles Dickens wrote a journal article insisting that the Inuit were lying and that if cannibalism did occur, it was among the Inuit themselves. This was an era when admitting that members of the British Navy could eat each other was politically and culturally unacceptable. Physical evidence settled the debate. Bones don't lie. But what exactly happened to the 105 people who abandoned their ships on April 22, 1848? The exact fate of each of them remains unknown to this day. We know the general outlines of the outcome. Not a single person reached the Buck River. Not a single one reached populated areas. The last survivors, apparently, died somewhere on the mainland shore opposite the island. King William, in the area now known as Sauk's Inlet and Cape Starvation. Inuit continued to find bodies for several years after 1848 singles, in pairs, in small groups. One body was found in a boat drifting in the near. Several bodies were in tents. Crozier, his fate is a separate question that remains unanswered. After Franklin's death, he assumed command and responsibility for 104 other people at a time when the situation was already hopeless. He left a note. Nothing else remained of him. No body. no personal belongings with reliable attribution. Some researchers have speculated that Crozier could have survived longer than the others, and even reached Inuit camps based on isolated Inuit stories of a surviving white man who was seen a year or two after the expedition's disappearance. These stories are unconfirmed, and in all likelihood are among the legends that arose around the expedition after its tragedy became known. Crozier died along with the rest, where exactly is unknown. The search for Franklin's expedition began in 1848, 3 years after the ships left England. This was the amount of time the Admiralty considered normal for an Arctic expedition to remain undetected. In 1848, several search expeditions set out for the Arctic. From the west through the Bering Strait, and from the east through Lancaster Sound, they found nothing. In 1850, the search assumed a scale that in itself became a landmark in the history of polar exploration. More than 10 British ships were simultaneously operating in Arctic waters. That same year, 3 graves were discovered on Beechey Island. This was the first physical evidence that the expedition had reached this point. But where it went next remained unknown for several more years. Lady Jane Fremlin became the driving force behind the search and the chief defender of her husband's reputation. She pushed for new expeditions, financed private searches, and rejected anything that undermined his heroic image. Especially Inuit stories of cannibalism. In Britain, a convenient version took hold for a long time. Franklin discovered the Northwest Passage and died a hero. Although as a shipping route, the passage was first traversed only by Roald Amundsen in 1903-1906. The Arctic was in no hurry to give up its last secrets. The Erebus and the Terror remained undiscovered for almost 170 years. The note: Dia gave the coordinates where the ships were stuck in the ice, but did not say where they were carried next. The Momus ice could move them south for months or years. In 2014, a Canadian search expedition found the Erebus in Queen Motte Bay, about 10 nautical miles south of where the crew abandoned the ships. It lay at a depth of about 11 meters, almost completely intact. Inside, cabins, bulkheads, and equipment were partially preserved. 2 years later, in 2016, the Terror was found. The ship lay north of Erebus in Terror Bay, which had received its name long before this discovery, as if the place itself knew it was buried there. The depth was approximately 24 meters. The condition was exceptional. Portholes were closed, the hatches were battened down. The ship looked as if it had been deliberately prepared for preservation before abandonment. This circumstance has given rise to one of the most fascinating debates in modern studies of the expedition. If Terror was deliberately wrecked, this means that someone returned to the ship after the main group sailed south in April 1848, or that some of the crew did not leave with the rest, but remained on board, and perhaps attempted to steer the Terror themselves. Juridical evidence, collected as early as the 19th century, contains stories of one of the 2 ships being seen under sail after the crew had abandoned both subnaws. If this is true, who was steering it? How many were there? Where were they going? Underwater exploration of the Terror in 2019 only deepened the mystery. Inside, everything looked as if the ship had been recently abandoned. A table, boxes, bottles on the shelves. Perhaps someone actually lived on board after the ships were officially abandoned. Perhaps water and currents created part of the picture. We can't be sure. There's very little certainty in this story. That's one of its main characteristics. We know the key points. 134 people left England, 129 went on after Greenland. The pros died on Beechey Island. In September 1846, the ships froze off King William Island. By April 1848, 24 people had died, including Franklin. The remaining 105 went south. No one made it. Between these points, there's a void. Almost 2 years between September 1846 and April 1848, about which there isn't a single written document, not a single diary, not a single logbook, not a single letter, not a single letter. All of this either remained on the ships, or it was destroyed by water and time, or it still lies somewhere inside cabins, crates, and flooded spaces. And so Franklin's story doesn't end with the discovery of the ships. On the contrary, it begins anew with them, because the answers to questions that have haunted explorers for nearly 200 years may lie at the bottom of the Arctic. Who was the last to close the terror hatches? Why was one ship so far from the other? Did anyone return aboard after the 105 men sailed south? And if they did, how long did they continue to struggle for life in complete silence when the whole world already believed them lost? Franklin's expedition was supposed to put an end to the search for the Northwest Passage. Instead, it itself became a gateway to one of the darkest, coldest, and most stubborn mysteries in maritime history.